I want to welcome you all here today. My name is Karen Pillar, the Executive Director at TeamChild. I've been here in this organization for a long time, started as an attorney representing young people, became the Director of Policy and Advocacy, and now most recently in the role of Executive Director. We are recording this conference and we will share the recording after. We're going to hear from a few speakers today, and then we will field questions from you. TeamChild is a civil legal aid organization. We represent youth who are or could become involved in the juvenile legal system. We advocate for our clients, and we advocate to address the root causes that funnel young people to the juvenile legal system. We do that through trying to make systemic change. We believe in lifting the voices of youth and families affected by the juvenile legal system, and have been working with the community, especially on this situation, for many months. We're working today and here today with a group called Kids Are Kids. Kids Are Kids is a group of affected families of incarcerated youth and community members who support and care about the youth and their families who are incarcerated. We're here to lift up their voices in advocacy for their loved ones. Their kids are our kids. I'd like to introduce Imijah Smith, who supports the community in so many ways, sharing her wisdom and building relationships to uphold the needs of young people and their families. Imijah?
Thank you, Karen. Hello, everyone. My name is Imijah Smith, and I am a community and family advocate, really helping the community and those like with advocacy, leadership, development, and really being a community builder, connecting families in particular with those who are incarcerated, whether it's youth incarceration or adult incarceration. We know that the key to healthy lives and success is making sure, first of all, we have community, but our families are connected with each other. That prevents recidivism, and it has been really the #1 key aspect of keeping our loved ones here with us on the outside from returning back and giving them hope to make sure that they're doing all that they can to remove themselves out of those confined spaces. I'm here, I've been advocating for many years and really familiar with the fact of the legislature creating a law that was keeping our youth to go to JRA to get the proper resources that they would need, particularly for their mental health, to make sure that they're getting the services, whether it's education, trauma-informed care, whatever that was needed. That was my understanding. So to see the abrupt separation, traumatic separation of those young people from Green Hill to DLC even brought me vicarious trauma. As an advocate that has worked to support families in the Department of Corrections, I'm very familiar with the lack of resources that the Department of Corrections currently has and trying to build. So I'm really curious, like how this decision was even helpful or even centered the wellness of those youth. Disconnecting those youth from the services that they did have, education that they did accomplish, moving them into DLC, especially if they were sentenced really long terms, will prevent them from some of those connections, prevent them from even accessing the opportunity at jobs, at education, just simply due to the fact that they may have long sentences. So I just wanted to share today the importance of how we get our youth back into a space where they can have the proper resources. The reason I believe that, and the community believes that Green Hill and some of the other youth prisons around this state are having such issues is because the state is not properly resourcing them. The solution is not to rip the young people out and blame the youth, but the solution is to pour the resources and proper resources and appropriate resources around their mental wellness and their education into JRA to make sure that we as community and citizens are ensuring that we are not harming, but actually rehabilitating, actually healing our young people so that they can be back with us as productive citizens. There's more to be shared, and I'm going to go ahead and pass my comment or pass my time to a family member, a parent with a youth at Green Hill. Renee?
Thank you, Amijah. My purpose of speaking today is to talk a little bit about the current conditions that exist at Green Hill. So my son is currently incarcerated at Green Hill. I also support a couple other young people that are incarcerated there. Ever since the beginning that my son entered JRA, I have grown increasingly appalled at his treatment that he's experienced there. The conditions are inhumane. There's a complete lack of mental health and disability services, and the utter just disregard of his health and well-being that Green Hill has shown since day one. Since the very beginning, I have been centered on ensuring that my son is rehabilitated. It's been my only goal. He will be released one day, and my goal, like any mother, is that he is safe and stabilized. My son, like so many of the other youth incarcerated, have trauma history and mental health needs that intersect with his rehabilitation needs. My son is not now and never has received the help he needs from JRA. At Green Hill, currently, there are no services to speak of that he's receiving. No therapy sessions or therapists, no research-based treatment programs. What they have done instead is just throw my son into a cell, cage him up in worse conditions that even an animal could thrive. The flat out reality is it is the opposite of the structured rehabilitative environment that we were promised. Inside Green Hill, my son has been exposed to more drugs, violence, and abuse than he ever had out here on the streets. Instead of rehabilitating him, they have re-traumatized him at every turn. The vast majority of my son's sentence so far has been spent isolated in an individual cell or doing absolutely nothing productive for hours, even when he and other youth beg for programming and help. He has witnessed extreme violence, including guards body slamming youth. There's been suicide attempts by youth, drug overdoses, and regular fights that take place. The only response to these concerns from DCYF has been to scapegoat their responsibility into a false narrative that the kids are to blame. And now DCYF has turned this to an issue of capacity. And as a result, they have taken their deflection of responsibility drastically and dangerously further by abandoning and transferring these 43 young men to the hands of DOC, claiming that this was an emergency decision and that they must sacrifice some to provide services for others. First of all, my question is, what services? The programming and therapists don't exist, and they won't magically appear once a lower capacity is reached. Secondly, we refuse to separate and sacrifice some for the claimed well-being of others. And I refuse to accept this as their answer to the problem that DCYF has created. Instead of investing in the rehabilitation that they are paid and tasked with, they have chosen to collaborate with Lewis County law enforcement and invest in the cycle of incarceration. They have consciously chosen to keep the kids that walk through their doors longer by criminally charging them regularly and excessively for behavioral issues that should be addressed through facility programming, treatment, and structure. This has resulted in so many of the young people there being charged with additional felonies. DCYF has knowingly allowed negligent and abusive conditions that perpetuate violence to persist for years. This isn't new. Then they have helped file charges against the young people victimized by their condition set, extending their sentences far past their release date and contributing to their own capacity issue. I worry about my son every single minute of every single day. I worry every day that instead of better, Green Hill will make his behaviors worse. I try every day when I talk to him to keep him grounded and to not fully become institutionalized from the conditions and environment at Green Hill. Despite these horrific conditions, I am still proud of my son. He has matured and grown over his time incarcerated and has held onto his own hopes, dreams, and goals for his future. But he can't do this alone. DCYF has an obligation to meet him more than halfway to ensure that he is rehabilitated to actually meet and reach these goals. DCYF must be held accountable for their failures to my son, the 43 young men transferred to DOC, and all the youth in this facility.
Thank you so much for sharing, Renee. I'd like to ask another family member who works with Kids Are Kids to also share their reflections.
Thank you, Karen. I am breathing a sigh of relief because my loved one was not one of the 43. I want to sincerely apologize to the 43 young men who were abruptly transferred from Green Hill to an adult prison with the Department of Corrections, and to Green Hill youth who are now traumatized from watching their friends being dragged out of Green Hill and are terrified that they will be next. I also want to apologize to families that learned over the weekend or are just now learning that this past Friday morning, DOC officers dressed in black came into Green Hill facility, put your loved ones in handcuffs, and informed them that they were now in the custody of DOC. Governor Inslee, Ross Hunter, legislators, all of you who make your careers and paychecks on the backs of the community, you all knew about the horrific conditions at Green Hill. Juvenile justice stakeholders had sounded the alarm months ago. Your silence in doing nothing is a collective failure. Abandoning the JR to 25 work is not an acceptable response to the state agency's failure to plan, execute, and deliver on its mandate. We demand that you do better for our youth. There are better options immediately available. Our main goal is abolition, which for us means the end of using punitive and isolating interventions to address the unmet needs of young people. Immediately return the youth to DCYF-JR who were illegally sent to DOC on July 12th, 2024. Governor Inslee, establish a priority release list to immediately release as many youth as possible from DCYF-JR to stop the extreme harm that is occurring. This was done during COVID in the adult facilities in Washington and across the country. Every young person who has met their minimum could be released immediately. Immediately release young and youth and young adults who are eligible for the Community Transitions Program, which was made law in 2021. And DCYF-JR has taken more than 3 years to implement. Immediately transfer youth eligible for community facilities to available community facility spaces. There are 8 community facilities and they are not full. Stop criminalizing youth at Green Hill. DCYF-JR worked with Lewis County to drop all new charges and recent charges against Green Hill youth related to contraband and accusations of prison riot. Provide services and programming by community. Hire a community mental health agency to provide therapeutic counseling for youth at JR to allow therapeutic relationship with adults who are not DCYF staff. Immediately invest $10 million already budgeted for new DCYF-JR facilities to hire community members with lived experiences to provide mentorship, programming, and support for the youth held at DCYF-JR. DCYF-JR should actively refrain all messaging that suggests that the youth and young adults are the reasons why there are staffing and program problems at DCYF-JR facilities. DCYF's decision package should include significant investments in alternatives to DCYF-JR for youth in their 2025 legislative priorities. And lastly, I want to say to community, today when you encounter a young person that you love, I want you to hug them tight. And I want you to close your eyes and imagine that young person being one of the 43 that have just been transferred to an adult prison. And then I want you to call your state legislators and demand that they uphold the commitment they made to serving young people in a developmentally appropriate program through JR to 25. Thank you.
Thank you so much for sharing all those words and the calls to action. I would like to invite Sarah Zier, the Director of Legal Services at TeamChild, to share some reflections and remarks.
To give context, I do want to share that TeamChild has represented over 80 youth housed at Green Hill within this last year, and many have reported horrible conditions and mistreatment like Renee described. So these are not one-off circumstances or things happening to a handful of youth. They're widespread throughout Green Hill. Second, and focusing on the transfer that occurred on Friday, the transfer was illegal. State law says that youth should be allowed to stay in juvenile rehabilitation facilities until they turn 25 years old. This is a developmentally appropriate policy that was passed for the benefit of youth and for communities where they will return. If the state wants to transfer youth to an adult prison, youth are supposed to get a hearing and a lawyer. The move was not only unlawful, it was immoral. Many of the 43 youth who were transferred were thriving in spite of the challenges that Renee discussed at Green Hill. The youth were positive influences on campus. Several recently graduated with their associate's and bachelor's degrees. Others created an award-winning music video about the dangers of fentanyl. And many had been promised a space in a new living unit that was set to open at Green Hill for youth who had been doing well. Green Hill leaders ran a competitive application process for a 20-bed living unit for youth who were meeting expectations on campus. Many of the youth who were suddenly transferred to adult prison had been accepted through the merits-based process and promised a bed in this new living unit. Green Hill was actively promoting their accomplishments and then betrayed them in an unnecessarily cruel way, as you've heard described. When I called campus on Friday, a Green Hill staff member asked me to call a young person's mother because he had been asking to call his mother while he was being shackled and taken to a DOC bus to go to prison. On Saturday, I reached out to another parent who had not been notified yet, and I had to break the news to her. She was shocked because her son was doing well at Green Hill. And contrary to some of the information put out by DCYF, he would have been eligible for the Community Transition Services Program, an electronic home monitoring program, for the end of his sentence, and never would have been exposed to prison if he had continued to do well. We implore DCYF and the governor, or for the legislature, to step in and reverse this transfer, and instead to work collaboratively with youth and community to address the conditions at Green Hill in a way that upholds rehabilitative values. I'll pass back to Karen.
Thank you, Sarah. We will take questions right now. We'd ask press members to raise their hand to ask a question or to put their question in the chat. some of our staff here at TeamChild to help facilitate making sure the questions are recognized.
Calling on Lauren. Go ahead and share your question.
Right, yes. So I understand the Civil Legal Aid Group has filed a preliminary injunction today to have the 43 men return to Green Hill. I was wondering, is TeamChild involved with that legal action or planning on filing anything in the courts themselves?
I'll pass it to Sarah for initial response.
We are collaborating with Columbia Legal Services, which filed that motion based on prior litigation and a settlement that was in place to prevent this kind of transfer without due process. I provided a declaration in support of their petition, identifying what you've heard from family here today, which is that this isn't an emergency situation. Green Hill has been long aware of the problems they've been building up over time, and they could have worked to come with a different solution to the challenges facing Green Hill. We're collaborating again by providing a declaration, and we're exploring other legal action on behalf of many of our clients who have been transferred.
I see a question in the chat. What types of offenders were transferred, and do you know anything about how they were chosen for the transfer? I only know what DCYF has, I think, said publicly regarding the decision. I don't know if any of the other panelists have more detailed information about who they chose and why. I think I would just like to comment that in the public statement from DCYF and Ross Hunter, there was a suggestion made the decision was equitable. And I would just challenge that the use of the term equitable for a decision like this. Yes, I would just reiterate also what has already been heard, what you've already heard today, which is it's certainly there were many young people that were sent that had made progress or were making progress in their own development. So doesn't seem like there was a lot of consideration made regarding what kind of activities or participation anyone was having within the facility. I see another question. What have you heard about newly sentenced youth at the county level who have not been moved to state facilities? Have any been placed in adult county jails due to being 18 plus? The decision from DCYF-JR to stop accepting new referrals that happened on July 5th is pretty new. I don't know in that kind of 10-day window how many youth sitting in juvenile facilities turned 18. I haven't heard any numbers yet regarding whether young people who were already sentenced to DCYF-JR, who then turned 18 after July 5th. I'm not sure. I imagine we'll hear about that. I'll open it up to anyone else who has had any more information.
Just in response to a couple of those questions, specifically, the practice across the state is fairly divergent. In many, and I would say most counties, when youth who are charged as adults for offenses they committed as juveniles turn 18, they are transferred to the adult jails. There are almost certainly youth sitting in adult jails, but I haven't spoken to individuals to confirm that. That is the typical practice, though, in many counties across the state.
I think the question also reminds me of some of the information coming out of DCYF-JR regarding resources. And I just want to reiterate that every time there's a discussion about resources, I really question why it's so challenging to find the resources that we're looking for to support young people the way we want. When there were resources, $10 million to build a fence around Echo Glen, and there's apparently enough resources to pay all these counties to hold these young people that they're not going to take. You know, that's not money that was already budgeted. And so the notion that we don't have access to resources, or we can't come up with them when we need them, I think is just rings untrue. And we would like to see DCYF-JR develop, reallocate resources for the meaningful support and intervention we're looking for. Regarding the question from Claudia Rowe, any information about the atmosphere at Green Hill presently in the wake of this upheaval? I will open it up to any of the family members if you want to respond to that. If you have, and then I'll let the family members go first. I think Sarah can respond after that, who's spoken to numerous people in the facility. But I'll pause here if there's a family member that wants to say anything about what they've heard regarding the atmosphere in the wake of this upheaval.
I can speak to it. Youth at Green Hill currently are scared. They're very scared. I said this in my statement that watching their friends being handcuffed and taken away from Green Hill, they're traumatized. They're scared that they are next. Even though DCYF, notified them, letting them know that, this will not, you are safe and there will not be any more transfers. But they don't believe that. So they're very afraid and they're traumatized. They're terrified that they will be next.
Thank you for sharing that. Anyone else in the family and community want to respond to that? And then I'll let Sarah go last.
I would just quickly, second that and validate what was just shared, because that was my son's experience. They immediately placed the entire campus on lockdown, rushed everybody to their rooms, and my son witnessed through his door this take place. And as was mentioned previously, DOC officers rush in all black and start moving furniture around and moving chairs around and locking personal items in a laundry room and just rushing in and just taking people, saying immediately to the youth, "You're in custody of DOC, put your hands behind your back." And these kids witnessed this. And again, these are their friends. These are their peers in there. And there was no advance notice. Nobody knew this was coming. Nobody had any idea what was happening. And they were shuffled away and nobody knew where they were really going. Truly. So it was a terrifying and traumatizing experience, obviously for the young men that were transferred, but also for pretty much everyone that was in there. And my understanding is staff may have not even known that this was happening. And staff, there are some great staff that have built relationships. And it is horrific what they've done. and it traumatized everyone.
Thanks, Renee. Sarah, do you want to, is there anything else you want to add? I see the other questions coming, but I'd like to continue to address this if there's other information to provide.
I just want to lift up what the family members have shared, that we've heard similar things from youth, that there were tears, panic, uncertainty. It was a very terrifying experience for the youth who were transferred and for those who remained behind. They didn't know what was going on. They're also just afraid at Green Hill now of what comes next. DCYF has said there will not be more transfers, but they denied that they were looking to transfer more youth to DOC in recent weeks as well, as a strategy for addressing the concerns. So there's not a lot of confidence, I think, from youth at Green Hill that they're safe or that this will improve conditions.
I think I'll just wrap up by saying I've also personally heard from youth at Echo Glen, and there are young women there who have the right to stay at Echo Glen until they're 25, and the atmosphere there also feels very tense and stressed. So it's having a larger impact even than just the Green Hill facility where the young men were forcefully removed. I see the next question is, in your knowledge, will they continue to give youth longer jail time? I'm not totally sure if I'm going to understand the context of this question, but I will respond in this way. One of our ongoing concerns in this past almost year, especially in the Green Hill facility, is that the response to young people's behavior with criminalization, with new charges, when some adult brings drugs into the facility and then the young person is in possession of them, that young person ends up with the charge. New charges when young people get into conflict or fights because the staff at the facility have failed to implement a safe and healthy living environment with the right support and structure, and in some ways intentionally allowing young people who are in conflict to live together and exacerbate conflict. Do we have any, we're demanding that they stop that behavior. So to answer your question, Gloria, I don't know if they will continue, but that particular behavior has given young people, many young people there, longer sentences. And in some cases, young people who only had a juvenile case now have an adult case because of that practice, which is a fairly devastating change. I know the families in the community, we talked about this in the webinar back in the spring. But if you have a juvenile,
yeah, sort of. I got your copy for you.
You will have opportunities for that record to be sealed. But if you have an adult conviction, that's unlikely. So the consequences are significant and long-term. Is there anyone else on the panel that wants to respond about continuing to give youth longer jail time about that question? And then we can move on to the next. The next question is, what kind of schooling or programming do students get in county jails? And I'll take a stab at this and then open it up. And just to respond and clarify terminology, because terminology, I'm going to pause for a second. Amijah, did you want to speak to the last question? Sorry.
I was willing to wait. I just wanted to highlight for our community across the state that Washington State currently has a really low age limit. I could be wrong or not totally correct, but my understanding is as young as 8 years old, that a young person could be charged as an adult in our current system. So Washington State, our leadership really we have some overhaul work to do with regard to this conversation. Oftentimes we think it might just be someone in their upper teens. It is not. To go as low as 8 years old, that's really saying something about our care and our thoughts about our children. Thank you. And Kids Are Kids have been advocating for a change in this policy. The legislature has not changed it as of yet, but I mean, the age range of 8 years old is significantly low. An 8-year-old does not understand what they were doing if they committed a crime that our courts could justify saying a person should be charged as an adult and get a lengthy sentence. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Maisha. So going back to the question about the education or schooling or programming in county jails, I just want to clarify some terminology. It matters to us. I'm not sure if it'll be distinguishable to you, but a young person under the age of 18, when they're held in a prison-like a jail setting in the county, that is often referred to as a detention center. And when they turn 18, then they're in a county jail. And I only point that out because in most circumstances, there are two facilities. There's a detention facility, those are for people under the age of 18, and there's a jail. And what is at least on paper available is technically different. Under 18 facilities, there is an obligation to provide an education, but the way our system is structured, a county detention facility is not built to hold someone for very long. It's not designed for long-term incarceration. And that has to do with where they are in the process. When you're being charged with a crime, young people do end up there for a long time. I want to be clear. A young person can sit in a county detention facility for a year or 2 years. It's not really designed well for that faction. You can only be sentenced to a county detention facility for up to 30 days. So it's considered and viewed as a shorter term process, but we are, as a state, legally obligated to educate youth in the county detention facilities. Our experience as TeamChild attorneys is that the provision of educational services in many county detention facilities is severely lacking. There have been lawsuits related to that. There has been litigation complaints related to that, but that has been a longstanding problem. And in fact, the state legislature attempted to tackle the complete failure, really, of all institutional education through a legislative action several years ago and adopted presumably a 4-year plan to improve this. We have yet to see really any manifestation of that 4-year plan. We're about 2 years into it. But they looked at the problem at the county detention facility, at the state JR prison facilities, and tried to identify a 4-year strategy to improve educational programming for young people in institutions. It continues to be and has always been TeamChild's position that really the best way to make sure a young person is successful in their education is to keep them at home in the community, in their community school. And that's really the ultimate goal, is to have the interventions and the supports we want for young people at home and in their community so that they don't have to figure out how to do an education program in an institution. In adult jail facilities, I would suggest that there's almost no programming for anybody, but I will pause to allow anyone else that wants to comment related to the question of what kind of schooling or programming do students get in county jails, whether that be the detention facilities for people under 18 or the county jails where many of these young people may go once they turn 18, if their case is either unresolved or if they have been sentenced to JR but are not going to be able to go to JR because of DCYF-JR's decision on July 5th. And if I'll offer the families first, if there's any comment from families, and then if Sarah, if you have anything else you'd like to add, I'll open that up to you too.
I'll just quickly add in the county detention facilities, there is education, they are legally obligated to provide educational access to the youth in the detention facilities. What that actually looks like, though, is similar to what exists in Green Hill at this time, unfortunately, is that it's often canceled due to staffing issues, safety and security issues, whatever administrations in those facilities are able to bring up for that day. A lot of times the educational access is canceled. And I think it's really important to also note that what this means for kids with disabilities that wind up in these detention facilities, kids that have IEPs. while again, they're obligated, under state law to implement their IEP within a detention facility, that doesn't happen. And many times what that does is it not only limits, at times it completely pauses the advancement of that youth's educational access for the time being while they are incarcerated in a detention facility.
Thank you, Renee. Very well said. Does any other family member want to comment? Or Sarah, is there anything else you'd like to add from your experience?
Just want to add briefly that there are challenges with access to education at Green Hill and at other juvenile institutions, but that is the place where more advocacy could be done to improve access to that education so school isn't canceled and students have more consistent pathways to get their education. Young people have been earning college diplomas. There are some questions about that from some youth about whether they were able to complete their final quarter before they were transferred to DOC and what the long-term impact of that will be. But there are some youth who have graduated. And so I want to suggest that we also hold the nuance of a lot of work to be done to improve access to education, and that for some it has been meaningless, but for others there is a beginning, and that we really could create a pathway for young people to get an education in these facilities that is deeply meaningful and will change their lives.
Thanks, Sarah. The next question in the chat: has JR limited access to young people in Green Hill or Echo Glen in recent weeks by families or attorneys? Have you or anyone else you know asked to tour the facility to gauge current conditions firsthand? I'll let the families respond about whether they've had limited access, and then Sarah and I can also respond, but I would just, for the TeamChild staff, when our attorneys are able to see young people in the facilities, I think they are able to see quite a bit of the current conditions. You can also hear a lot about the current conditions when you call young people. I can say that myself, having spoken to them and what I can hear happening in the facility while I'm talking to young people. I would wonder if an actual tour led by DCYF-JR staff would be more revealing. I think what's revealing is what I can hear and see when I talk to young people directly. But I'm going to invite any of the family or community who want to respond about limited access to young people in recent weeks, or any other comments about the current conditions firsthand.
Well, Karen, Imija here, I would just want to highlight what we know in the public already. Highlight the fact that there is a culture in Green Hill in particular, and I believe it's a culture across youth and adult prisons across the state, of the staff, setting up like dogfighting, setting up fighting competitions, setting up young people to be physically harmed. There is a history already about Green Hill and the sexual abuse that has gone on there for some time, but there is a culture and an environment already in place. And so the recent information that was on the news and brought to the public's attention of how the staff are handling things, laughing when kids are being put into fights, setting these young people up. Then here comes DCYF and others blaming the youth for that. So I just want to talk about that in general at Green Hill, in addition to what's now occurring. And then the concern in terms of having someone rush in black, put you in handcuffs, tell you to take off your shoes, no contact with your family. That also is a result of the culture of Department of Corrections and DCYF. And I just want to say that DCYF as being our administrative state agency to protect our children and protect our youth, needed to have taken into considerations how you would properly make these adjustments. That was not taken into consideration at all. And I think there should have been a conversation with the Department of Corrections. Department of Corrections is coming with the way that they handle business as usual. But DCYF had a whole nother responsibility in terms of how we're handling young people, because when you get into Department of Corrections, it takes the individual, for the most part, because of the lack of resources, of figuring out how to heal themselves. So we have now layered a whole nother level of trauma for young people who are just figuring themselves out, dealing with their issues already, to now another layer of healing themselves. So I say all this to say that the culture in Green Hill, anything that's happening now is being exacerbated, it's being put on top of, it's being exponential more harm than I think was previously there. Thank you.
Thank you, Elijah. Does any other family member want to respond about access to family or attorney visits or the current conditions? I mean, we heard quite a bit about the current conditions from Renee and the other family member, but is there anything more you'd like to say to this question?
If the family doesn't, I will just add, we have had difficulty getting legal calls that youth have requested, particularly getting youth to be accessible by phone in private spaces without staff intervention. On confidential calls, this DCYF Green Hill has asked that our attorneys visit on Fridays since about April. And I requested typical legal visits for this Friday, July 12th, and I was denied. They cited staffing issues and said that I couldn't come be present at the facility on Friday because they didn't have the staff. And that was when they then transferred youth to Department of Corrections. It's been a persistent issue that we have been trying to elevate to Green Hill leadership and JR leadership about the challenges that we've had reaching clients by phone and in person at the facilities. We haven't done a recent tour, I will say, although I believe Green Hill has invited many members of the media and legislators. I've been meeting with clients when I've seen legislators tour the facility and view firsthand. My strong recommendation to get a sense about the conditions is to listen to families and listen to youth, because there's a lot of cross truth talking that happens. And one example is that DCYF Green Hill promotes that they have low levels of room confinement and solitary confinement, but they use those as terms of art. Youth are held in their rooms for extraordinarily long periods of time every day as a programming decision because there aren't enough staff available. So the truth is that young people have been isolated in their rooms at the same time that Green Hill talks about low statistics for room confinement as a punishment for behavior. So the truth kind of gets passed when these tours are happening, and it's important to really listen to young people about their experience. Just want to lift up again that this isn't the experience of one or two youth. It's been very pervasive at Green Hill and overwhelming to hear from the number of young people, even young people who are doing well by Green Hill and JR measures and participating in graduating programs, are also lifting up the problems with conditions at Green Hill.
Thank you, Sarah. I've also heard directly from young people that they cannot get a confidential phone call with an attorney, which is their right, and a lot of negative comments similar to what you've heard from the family members, but young people sharing the comments they're hearing from staff. The one that I heard most recently is that you have to earn your right to be treated like a human being. That's what the staff have told them. So I would say those are the things that help me gauge current conditions more than a tour. The next question, are there any inferences to draw from the suspension of intakes and transfers to DOC as to the degree of good faith from DCYF in honoring JR to 25? As the person who'd been in the role of policy director at TeamChild and have been here since we implemented the policy changes in the state of Washington, I've been really concerned in this past year about the commitment DCYF has to serving young people to JR, to 25, sorry, in the JR facility. And I was really concerned on July 5th when they were closing intake, that the way they would respond to the pressure would be to move a bunch of young people to DOC. So I'm as surprised and terrified and upset about what happened a week later. It does feel like that moment in time was a convenient sort of way to walk away. It feels like an abandonment of that commitment. And I guess in light of that, I just want to remind everyone the history here. So in 2015, almost 10 years ago, the state of Washington started to make the commitment to serve young people in a developmentally appropriate way by allowing young people who had adult convictions to be served in the rehabilitative program of JR, which is called Juvenile Rehabilitation. So that work, they back then called the Youthful Offender Program, brought young people back to JR from DOC when they were 18, 19, 20, 21. So they started this work over 10 years ago, which is one of the reasons why it's so frustrating for them to have done specifically what they did on Friday, to respond with terror in a false sense of emergency and crisis in that day for a situation that they have been tasked to build for 10 years. And then in 2018, they expanded that effort to be more in line with science and brain development by allowing the youthful offenders to stay at JR till 25. In 2019, they made it retroactive. So the effort to serve young people to 25 in a developmentally appropriate way has been a commitment of the state of Washington for almost 10 years. It's deeply grounded in science. We have the United States Supreme Court and our own state Supreme Court making law on it on top of the state legislature. So any sort of lack of planning, lack of organization, lack of coordination from the state to really make this possible, it feels harmful. It feels like they're contrary to what we all know is the right thing to do, what the law requires us to do, what science tells us to do. And if there anyone else in the family community that want to respond to the question, are there any inferences to draw from the suspension of intakes and transfers to DOC as to the degree of good faith from DCYF in honoring JR to 25? Anyone else want to make a response to the question? Sarah, I know, has also worked very closely on this issue and with young people who are receiving the JR to 25 support. So I'll also invite Sarah to respond.
Candidly, I can't infer good faith at this point. We have been reaching out to and meeting with Green Hill leadership and JR leadership since January about the deteriorating conditions at Green Hill, and families have been doing the same. There have been many attempts to sound the alarms and work on solutions, and we have not gotten traction or success in response to multiple suggestions and requests for collaboration. These institutions are demanding that young people respect the law and believe in our legal system, and yet they're continuing to traumatize, disappoint, and further criminalize these youth. Picking up a young person in the manner that you've heard from families and that youth have conveyed to us without notice, without giving time to say goodbye, without giving time to tell their families where they're going, and denying them opportunities to talk to their lawyer is not something you do if you think the actions are right, moral, or lawful. At this point, I hope DCYF-JR, the governor's office, and the legislature will take different actions to begin to rebuild trust and do the right thing by these young people, including making space for youth in a juvenile rehabilitative setting, improving conditions so that they can stay as the law demands until they're 25.
Thank you, Sarah. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. You're going to receive an email with a press packet on all the issues we discussed today. Those of us who can stay, we can stay on for a few minutes longer if there's other questions to answer, but in recognition of the time, we're going to invite people to leave as they need to. We appreciate you being here. We really hope that you will help us tell this story. I know that there's been a lot of coverage of this issue, but I think the message we want people to hear is what the families and the community are experiencing directly. And we hope you'll be able to lift those voices with us. So I really want to appreciate the family members and the community who came to support the young people today. Family members from Kids Are Kids and Renee and Maija. Really appreciate Sarah, and I just also want to appreciate my entire TeamChild staff and team. We have been very busy trying to support the young people and their families who have been traumatized in this last week and scared and terrified, and it's been a tiring week and a really disappointing week. I have been heartbroken for holding the conversations that I've had and that my teammates have had. So thank you for your time. We'll pause here for a few more minutes if there's any other questions. Question in the chat about contact with youth that have been transferred. We at TeamChild have been able to speak with some. My understanding is some families have been able to speak to some youth. I don't know if there's families here that want to speak to that. I'll also tell you that the community that cares about these young people have been rallying in response and doing as much as they can in their networks to try to support these young people that got transferred. Notifying other loved ones who are in the DOC facilities to look out for them. Family members, is there any other comment about contact with the youth transferred?
Yes, I can speak to that as well. Was able to speak with a young person that was part of the 43. He just described, what the conditions were and how long they were going to be at Shelton. He said that they were told that they would be there for a month and then would be transferred to an adult facility. And that was basically, what he knew. But as he gained additional information, he would connect with us.
Thank you so much. Go ahead, Sarah.
Yes, I've been in contact with 2 youth directly who have been transferred, and we're working to get in contact with many others. We're also working to facilitate so that youth have at least enough money on their books to be able to make initial calls to family, because in the DOC system, you have to have money on your system to be able to call your family members and loved ones, even for some of those initial calls. So we're working to make sure that all the young people who are transferred can have family contact.
Thanks, Sarah. I know there's not time for it today, but the difference in the experience of a young person in a JR facility and a DOC facility is so profound and severe. I think Maija actually spoke to it really well. How differently they're designed. So that the trauma of that immediate moment is only the beginning of the trauma for the young people who are going to now navigate DOC. It's the whole point of the JR to 25 was to give people the time to grow up and to complete development and to gain rehabilitative interventions before having to go and navigate an even more harmful system. Thank you so much. I think with that, we'll say goodbye.